Chapter 39 The Thunder Helm. Zelda had only spent minutes trying to stop the Calamity's attack when she lost consciousness, based on the length of the shadows. However, she had spent several hours recovering before resuming her corporeal form. The afternoon was winding on. Women were trickling out of the homes in which they'd taken shelter. Those who had stopped in the barracks would probably take longer. That made sense. They'd had no warning that the Calamity was striking until it had already happened. To trust the assumed safety of their ordinary lives must have been an uneasy prospect. Or would be. People wouldn't be adjusting already. She had to look around only a little to confirm this. Those who were out were mostly Gerudo, and of those primarily shop owners who were checking on the condition of their wares. The fallout of the blast hadn't been as bad as Zelda had expected. The desert had been littered with debris, but in Gerudo Town it had mostly been a hail of pebbles. Enough to hurt, yes, and there were broken signs and cracked tiles all over the square. But word had come in time. Whatever injuries had been sustained were, hopefully, quite minor. Gerudo Town had been spared the worst of things. She wondered about Karakara Bazaar, further removed from Ground Zero but less fortified. Certainly everything to the west. Well, everything to the west of the impact no longer existed. But there had been no settlements in the path of the blast. No shrines, either. Certainly there had been some Miega. The thought was unbidden, and her first instinct was to push it away. Instead she picked it up, turned it over in her mind, and decided that the death of the Yiga did bother her. But she was relieved, too. Relieved that they were no longer trying to kill her. Relieved that it would be a burden off of Pai's mind. Relieved that Ganon no longer had another avenue by which to exercise its power. Am I relieved that I am not grieving over the loss of so many lives? That I'm not even trying to rationalize how they all would have died anyway, no matter what else I did? No answer was forthcoming. Fine. She'd carry that around with her for as long as she needed to. A crowd of people was gathered in the training yard outside of the palace. Hundreds of women had turned the act of taking shelter in an emergency into a community event, and fires had been built and pots set to simmering with foods that smelled of rich, savory spices. Zelda was hungry, and the promise of good food and good company pulled at her, more so when an older woman spotted her, decided she looked hungry, and tried to wave her down with a wooden spoon, but something else pulled more insistently. She moved through the crowd, and the crowd generally paid her little mind. That was good. Being lost in a crowd could be a good thing, she'd decided, and being alone in a crowd was a good thing in a different way. She stepped into the barracks. Here the off-duty guards of Gerudo Town were gathered, a smattering of them running about the place and gathering food for the impromptu feast being held outside, but most trying to relax in the wake of whatever great work had been placed on them in the last few hours. They looked exhausted, Zelda thought, and for these women that was saying quite a lot. A large ring of spectators were gathered, the ones closer and sitting on the floor and the ones further out standing, as two gods, Lena and Kata, were telling a story in the center, accompanied by very expressive body language. So in front of us the crowd is churning, and Kata has used the poor blizzard rod so much it has nearly shattered. Scattered laughter as Kata pantomimed hitting the rod against her hand, and even eyeballing the tip of it to make sure it was still working. Whatever reprimand they'd been expecting was not enough to take away from the glory of the work they'd done. Good. And behind me I hear this sound, like cutting open a piece of fruit. I turn around and I see the little silver-haired Vi, and she moves. Lena gestured with her fingertips instead of her whole arms, indicating an alacrity that she wouldn't be able to mimic. Like no one you've ever seen. And the monster she's fighting, the beast in the shape of a Vi. And on it went as Lena described the fight that Pai had been waging in the middle of the chaos. Absorbed in the telling of the story, Lena did not notice one person passing through on the edge of the room, but Zelda caught Kata's eye. The two of them exchanged glances, and the god winked and then jerked her head in the direction of one of the doors. Zelda bowed her thanks and continued on, leaving the storytellers to their story and the victors to their victory. The barracks infirmary was empty, save for Paya, who was sitting up in a bed, and a single guard who was standing a listless watch within arm's reach. When Zelda stepped in, Paya was reading her diary, but at the sound of Zelda's heel touching the flooring her head whipped up and her eyes shone. Almost instantly the guard's hand came down and pressed on Paya's shoulder. Paya blushed furiously, tried to give the guard a reproachful look, failed. So, instead, Zelda came to her. Zelda. Paya said, and hearing her speak plainly and openly in her own voice made Zelda's throat tighten in a way she hadn't been expecting.
I am so very glad you made it back safely.
She was speaking formally, defaulting to lip mode because there was someone else present.
You under Chief Riju's orders. I've been confined to bed until I am cleared by an appropriate authority.
There was a chair near Paya's bed. Zelda pulled it up, took a seat in it.
Who would qualify as an appropriate authority? She didn't say. But now there's a guard posted, and I can.
She shook her head.
It is difficult to convince someone of your health when they will not examine you for injuries.
Zelda thought on that.
I would be willing to wager that they gave you a thorough physical examination while you were unconscious. If they have you confined to bed, it is for some other reason.
She could think of a few, offhand, but did not want to hazard a guess. Then Paya did it for her.
Is it because of what happened?
Silence between them. Silence made sharper and more oppressive by the expressionless guards standing watch over them. We need to talk. We can't do it like this.
Please pardon my foolish question,
Zelda said to the guard in Gerudo.
But do I need to seek permission from the Honored Chief Riju to speak to my friend in private?
The guard turned toward Zelda, knit her brow, and then said in startlingly comfortable-sounding Hylian, I have been told to give the two of you as much time alone as you need, provided that Paya does not get out of bed. Oh. Zelda blinked. Process that. Continued in Hylian.
I will make sure that she does not. You have my word.
Good.
I will be outside of the door. Please let me know when your visit is concluded.
Without another word, she strode from the room, shutting the door behind her. More silence as Zelda and Paya stared after her, at the shut door. Paya said slowly,
Why would Chief Riju want us to have time alone if I am supposed to be under watch? It is difficult to guess.
Frankly, Zelda had no idea.
Is that your diary? Did you get it from the inn? No.
Paya's color had risen again, though it was difficult to tell if that was still frustration at having been ordered not to get out of bed.
I actually gave it to her. For safekeeping, when we went to the Yiga Fortress, in case. Well, just in case. I told her it was full of very sensitive information and was to be delivered to my grandmother in the event that I could not do so myself, and stressed how important it was that she keep its confidence without reading it. So, she came to visit me, when she heard I was in the infirmary.
That was something. Riju must have heard of Paya's exploits from Liana's squad.
Did she visit for long? I don't know, actually. She was here when I woke up. She seemed very agitated.
Paya looked down at her hands.
I suppose she would be, with how frightened everyone else seemed. But she was happy to see me awake, I thought, and before she left she said something to me in Gerudo. Later, the guard translated for me. Apparently it was something like, do your best.
Zelda blinked again.
What an odd thing to say. I thought so, too.
More quiet. The silence was becoming a physical thing, threatening a wall between them. Zelda swept it aside.
You think they might be confining you because of what happened in the Yiga hideout?
Paya didn't look up. She didn't speak. She just nodded.
Hi. It's hard to talk about.
Paya's voice wavered as she spoke.
All of it. Everything.
There was a moment where Zelda considered opening herself, offering to simply let their minds touch and let things be communicated that way. There was another moment where she thought she should be gentle, and let Paya have her silence. There was dignity in silence, and she respected Paya enough to want to preserve that dignity at almost any cost. But that word, almost, was very important.
I know it is difficult,
Zelda said.
But I think we have to. There are some things we need to work out between the two of us. If talking about the events is hard, then focus on what it made you feel. On what you're thinking now.
Once more Paya spent a very long time turning this over in her mind. She set her diary down on her lap and began playing with her fingers, tracing her fingertips with the pads of her thumb, left pinky to right pinky and then back again. Calming herself while she thought. Concentrating while she talked.
When Ganon had me,
Paya said, eyes still locked on her hands,
I thought about how much I had failed. Some of that was the calamity's influence on my thoughts, I am sure. but not very much of it. It used me as a
long pause.
weapon against you. Because
The Shaker girl's jaw clenched, the muscles standing out as she fought past this barrier.
Because I love you.
There. That was out, at least.
It used that feeling to exploit me. It used how you answered that feeling to strike at you.
Pi held up her right hand. She could not hold it still.
When I hit you, I felt it as if I had struck the blow myself. I can still feel the sting. It's sharper than memory is supposed to be. And then you came for me.
Zelda said.
You didn't want me to come for you?
Now, at last, Paya lifted her head.
Oh, of course. I wanted to be rescued. I was so frightened. I have never felt anything like that, even in my worst nightmares. The vulnerability, the hopelessness.
Zelda nodded. It was remarkable how little she was feeling, now, knowing what Paya was about to say. An emotional shock, perhaps? A kind of spiritual insulation? It didn't matter.
Go on. I saw you on the horizon and Ganon told me how important I'd been in making you so vulnerable. How your heart couldn't help but answer the hearts of others. I saw you, and it was like looking at the goddess, and I thought how something so beautiful, so extraordinary, was in so much danger because of me.
She lowered her eyes again.
What would have happened if Link hadn't been there?
Oh, yes, there. The hand clenching in her chest, that moment of reflection and realization that she wanted to shun away but could not allow herself to. Mytha's words in her mind, Zelda said.
I knew he would be there. I understood what Ganon was doing. Not totally. Just enough to know that it was near Link. I was betting on the hero coming to our aid.
Why was this familiar? She reached up, wiped at her eyes.
I used him.
That hung in the air between them. Then Pi said,
Would you still have come after me if Link hadn't been there?
We have hit a turning point. You know what she's going to say, to do, if you tell her the truth. I cannot lie to her. Not about anything, and not about this.
Yes,
she said, because it was true. The shaking in Paye's hands became more pronounced, but her face was remarkably controlled as she turned it back down to her lap. Not a twinge of expression. Her body quivered. Once. She was holding her breath. Zelda reached out, touched Paye's hand. Paye pulled away. Zelda sat back in her chair. Waited. Distantly, she realized she felt numb again.
I cannot be a weakness for you,
Paye said, the words coming out in a smooth, even rhythm. She sounded so calm. She must have been trying very hard.
I cannot. I would sooner be alone. I would sooner return to Kakariko village in shame.
Zelda could feel her about to say one more, I would sooner, but it was left mercifully unspoken. Zelda was quiet for a long time. Waited for Paye to say anything else. Searched for anything else to say. Came up short on both counts. Slowly, so slowly that only Paye's hearing would be sharp enough to detect it, she got out of her chair. She wasn't trying to be slow, or to sneak, or anything. She wasn't trying anything. She hadn't consciously decided to get up and leave. She was just doing it. It was the thing to do.
I'll let the guard know that we've finished,
she said. Then she was gone. Riju shifted nervously back and forth. She was less nervous now than she'd been some minutes ago. The fear that Zelda had died in the blast to the north had been a very real one until she'd been spotted in the barracks. But now Riju was dealing with a different kind of nervousness. She stood on the balcony outside of her room. She would have normally been in the audience room at this time of day, but today was not a usual one, and it helped for her to be able to look at her people and for her people to be able to look at her. The thunder helm was in her hands, and it seemed heavier than it had been before being stolen. That wasn't a real thing. Metal helmets didn't get heavier just from things happening around them, but it felt heavier. A number of very brave women had risked their lives to get it back. A much greater number of people had died trying to hold on to it. That made it heavy, right? That felt right. She held it at level with her waist, then at level with her heart. Down again. Up again. Looking out over the square, Nobody would be able to see her hoisting the ancient relic of her people like a training weight, but anybody who stepped onto the balcony from the stairs behind her would have a perfect view.
What in the world are you doing?
Bully Era's question was somewhere between amused and genuinely, deeply perplexed.
I'm trying,
Riju responded,
to find a pose that best communicates the dignity of my office and the gravity of the sacred treasure I'm holding.
She fought the urge to fidget.
I would appreciate some advice.
Bully Era sighed. Riju looked over her shoulder, watched as the god stepped away from her spot at the threshold of Riju's bedroom, and walked around the balcony to stand on the stairs, a bit further down than a relatively short visitor would be, to match the head height. Bully Era could always be counted on to understand what was really important.
Give me a moment,
her god said, and Bully Era walked back up and disappeared into Riju's room. She came out with a plain dais, which Riju had been using for stacking books, and set it down next to where Riju still stood.
Put the thunder helm here.
Riju scowled.
Would I be blocking it from view? Only initially. 2 steps after she first sees you, your guest will see the thunder helm behind you. The effect will be most striking.
Still scowling, Riju placed the thunder helm as instructed, rotating it so that its front faced the square below. Well, that was a good effect.
Excellent. Now clasp your hands. No, not in front of you. Clasping your hands in front of you is the posture of a guard at best and a supplicant at worst. It is for Hylian princesses, not for the chiefs of the Gerudo. Behind you, under your braid. Do not interlace your fingers. Wrap the fingers of your right hand loosely around your left fist. Relax both hands. You're showing strain in your forearms. Keep your shoulders back. Spine straight. Your hair will not hide your hands, so do not play with it.
Riju did as instructed. It was a stiff pose, and not one she could hold comfortably for very long, but she was reasonably sure that her guest would be arriving momentarily.
Like this? Yes.
Bully Era sighed again, a wistful sound, this time.
You look every inch the chief. If only you had a few more inches.
Riju rolled her eyes but kept holding the pose. She had hoped to see her guest coming from the square, but the woman had been spotted leaving the infirmary in the barracks, which meant that she'd be coming in through a side entrance. All the guards had been instructed on where to direct the guest, though none of them knew who she actually was. This really was going to turn into a conversation, wasn't it? But still, first impressions mattered. They were when one impressed. This is definitely a second impression. Second impressions also matter. They also matter a lot. Perhaps 30 seconds more passed before soft-heeled boots counted their way up the steps. Stride too short, steps too light, to be one of the guards. Riju relaxed her shoulders and looked down at the people in the square. There really was a lot to see. After a moment it was no longer an act.
Chief Riju.
Zelda sounded tired, even in Gerudo. Little wonder that. Riju almost turned her head, almost spoke. Instead she gestured, with a tilt of her neck, for Zelda to come stand beside her. Zelda, the actual Princess Zelda who had disappeared 100 years ago, if there had ever been any doubt on that account, stepped up to the balcony. She held her hands in front of her, and looked down on the people in the square with soft, sad eyes. Not that her expression was sad. Her eyes were sad, as if that were their default state. Bully Era would have said that hers were the kinds of eyes that could hide cunning.
The Gerudo are all well,
Riju said, finally breaking her silence.
You brought word in time, to say nothing of what you did in Caruso Valley.
Zelda hesitated. If Riju had to guess, the Hylian girl wasn't sure if she believed what she was being told, but on the other hand, she might have also been thinking about something else. Was Zelda distracted?
I am glad to hear that. Is everyone well, truly? Yes,
Riju said.
We had one woman, an off-duty guard, and drunk nearly to blindness, who was struck on the head by a pebble the size of the last joint of her thumb. Luckily for her, she is as hard-headed as she is irresponsible, and required nothing more than stitches.
She looked up at Zelda out of the corner of her eye.
There was damage, of course.
Zelda nodded, waiting for Riju to continue.
Caruso Valley is gone. There is an area, beginning just to the east of the Yiga hideout and stretching out nearly to the sea, where nothing is left. It's been difficult to observe for the past several hours, but our best estimations say that everything north of the valley's mouth and everything south of Ratumala Hill no longer exists.
Saying that, it didn't sound like very much. An abstraction that you could mark down on a piece of paper. Riju, though, had stood on top of the water tower, had seen the firestorms and the lightning dancing there. There had never been any devastation like that wrought in Hyrule history, she thought. If there had been, the land would still bear the scars. An entire people could vanish without a trace, blown away on the wind by such power. Yes, she'd wanted to impress Zelda. Had been excited to talk to her, to hear about her adventures, to talk to her about Paya. Yes. But now, speaking of the things that really mattered, the things that should concern a chief, as Buliera might say, she felt some twinge of the same weight, the same sadness, that seemed to hang so heavily around the Hylian princess. Zelda turned to her. Riju turned in answer, so the two stood squarely, eyes locked. For some reason, the weight of Zelda's eyes was alarming.
Please forgive me for asking so rashly in light of the catastrophe that nearly befell your people,
Zelda said, her earnestness demanding she speak in Hylian.
But I need your help. With reaching Von Aboris, I assume.
Riju allowed herself a tight smile when Zelda nodded in the affirmative.
Then it is well that you have returned the Thunder Helm to us. You do not need to ask. Von Aboris, as it is now, is a threat to the Gerudo that must be addressed. And if, in addressing that threat, we might also address the threat of the calamity, well, that is certainly worth one good fight, isn't it?
Zelda nodded, looking duly impressed, which, good, because it meant she couldn't see how frightened Riju was by the prospect of riding out into the desert. Not because of Von Aboris, but because of Ganon. Zelda bowed.
Thank you, Chief Riju. I look forward to working together in this.
Riju waved her hand. They'd reached the point in the conversation where dropping formalities would seem like a concession, even a favor, from her. Which was good, because she was getting tired.
We'll save that for when we are prepared to leave, I hope. Have you had time to visit your companion? I have. Thank you for asking. She is well.
A pause.
May I ask why she is forbidden to get out of bed?
Did you talk? Riju replied.
The stories that Leona's squad told on their return were fraught. We could tell that she was not physically wounded when she was brought in, but we had to be sure that there were no further complications arising from the trials she'd been through. In truth, I have only been waiting for your approval before releasing her.
Zelda nodded.
Thank you for being so concerned. She is well, and suffers no lasting effects. Wonderful. I will send word to have her released, then.
Right after I'm done talking to you.
Will it be the three of us approaching Von Aboris, then? I do not believe Paya will be joining us. No? No? I suppose she would need rest, after what she went through.
Zelda's eyes cut away from Riju, looking back out toward the square as she said,
She may decide to return to Kakariko village, now.
Riju was, distantly, very proud of herself for not shrieking. Behind her she heard the light jangle of her bodyguard's earrings as Buliera's head whipped around in surprise. After half a beat of silence, Riju said,
Oh.
Another beat, then.
That would be a shame, wouldn't it?
What are you doing? Don't interfere in this. Was that her internal voice, or was it just what she thought Buliera would be screaming at her? Maybe both. Zelda watched the people in the square.
Paya is a capable warrior, and she has been a stalwart companion during my journey, but she fears that her presence will be a greater danger than her absence. Now, that should create a vulnerability.
The princess sighed softly.
May I speak plainly?
Of
course. If we intend to face down the darkness in Von Aboris together, then I think we should be friends. Please, relax, and feel free to say whatever is on your mind. I would happily be your confidant. I don't know what to do.
All right. Riju hadn't expected her to speak that plainly. Maybe vanishing for 100 years made it so one really meant it when they started to share their secrets.
I do not want to endanger her needlessly. I don't want to go against her wishes. I don't even know that I disagree with her. She thinks of herself as a vulnerability because...
Here Zelda paused.
Because you are precious to her.
That made Zelda look at her again, eyes hard and analytical.
You are alarmingly observant.
Don't say pie is like an open book. Don't say pie is like an open book.
By the same token, she is precious to you. Perhaps not in the same way as you are to her, but is it possible that you want to protect her, too? That is why you were thinking of sending her back?
Zelda's face went through a startling number of expressions very rapidly as she processed what had just been said to her. Riju could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She wouldn't be replying for a while. So instead, Riju continued.
Please, forgive me for being so forward. Still, I think it is worth considering why both of you do or do not wish to travel together. Certainly it is not a decision to be made hastily. Anyone dear to us is a vulnerability, yes. But that vulnerability can be its own source of strength. Having someone to protect can make you stronger, fiercer than you thought yourself.
That was probably going too far. Still, when she really thought about what she was saying, she did agree with it. Even if the protective instinct didn't make one better, necessarily, it could help to have people near you that you cared about. History books were full of accounts of brave women who fought harder to protect those next to them, which was one of the reasons keeping squads together was such an important concept among the Gerudo armed forces.
I'm sorry,
Zelda said, and Riju snapped back to attention.
But it seems I've underestimated your insight.
Aw. Well, no point not sharing a little bit too, right? Paya had certainly shared enough with her. Unknowingly.
Don't apologize. That's just something my mother used to say to me. You were close?
The gentle words of someone who had also lost her mother. Hyrule was not kind to mothers.
So I'm told.
She couldn't remember, of course. Silence stretched out between them. Without prompting, both ended up facing the square again. It was soothing to see people going about their lives, laughing in the way they did in the wake of barely diverted disaster. One could divorce oneself from dangers to come, looking at them. Maybe she should have been drawing strength from seeing her people, rather than using them as a distraction. I
have found myself thinking of Urbosa,
Zelda said. That made Riju look up. Parts of Urbosa's diary had been recovered, but not all of it. There were gaps, but the great Urbosa's intimacy with the Queen of Hyrule was plain between every word.
It is funny. I was wounded 100 years ago and lost my memory in the healing of those wounds. I should not have any feelings associated with her, yet think of her all the time. I can remember her in bits and pieces, now, as my memory comes back.
A pause.
I think I loved her a very great deal. I cannot say what she was to me, but I can say that.
Riju frowned. Well, now they really were sharing.
I think about her, Tin. Not as you do. Those thoughts I saved for my mother. But Lady Urbosa, the great Urbosa. I think sometimes about the shadow she casts, still. Each chief after her has stood in that shadow, in her own way. If she'd lived in a different time, she would have been one of the 7. I look out of Fawn Aboris, some nights.
She stopped, catching herself.
Please,
Zelda said.
If you're comfortable. I'm not,
Riju said, because that was true.
But I'll try anyway. I like to go to the top of the water tower and look at the desert, at night. Seeing Fawn Aboris raging for the past months has been painful. I think of Urbosa. Even she failed, and she was one of the greatest chiefs in our history. I am so...
She searched for a better word, found nothing.
I am so small, compared to her. I understand,
Zelda said. Just that, just 2 words, but they were the truth. That meant a great deal. Riju thought about how long she'd spent trying to craft an impression and felt not silly, but bad. She'd done Zelda a disservice. And Paya. And herself, really.
That is enough reflecting,
Riju said.
Knowing our own smallness doesn't mean we can set aside our duties, does it? No,
Zelda agreed.
Then we have to do these things for ourselves even if we don't think we can. Even if we have very spacious helmets to fill.
She turned to the thunder helm, took it up in her hands. It was heavy, dazzlingly heavy, but in that weight there was power. The metal sang to her, beckoned to her, told her that so long as she held it then things would be all right. My mother wore the thunder helm, so did her mother, so did the great Urbosa. It's mine, whether I think I can handle it or not. without hesitating, because if she hesitated she was not going to be able to go through with this. She put the helmet on, crossed her arms very authoritatively, and turned towards Zelda.
Well, how do I look?
The helmet slipped down. She sighed, pushed it back up into place. It was so big it was almost impossible to see out of without constantly adjusting it. She almost missed the golden light shining from Zelda's eyes. Prayer was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be the easiest thing in the world, and then through focus you made it into something more. Something grand. Something important. Zelda was 8 years old. In the 2 years since her mother had died she had, at her father's command, prayed and prayed and prayed. She had prayed until she couldn't think anymore. She had prayed until she had fallen asleep. She'd prayed without eating. She'd prayed without drinking water. But prayer had never been easy. She didn't understand why it was supposed to be. Her mind was always full of thoughts, and memories, and what she wished she was doing instead. She tried to make the thoughts go away, but she never could. She always ended up thinking about something else. Maybe that was why the goddess hadn't spoken to her, yet. Maybe that was why.
Zelda!
Urbosa's voice, calling from the shore of the Spring of Power. Zelda raised her head to answer.
And not yet.
She clamped down hard with her teeth, trying to stop them from chattering.
I haven't heard anything yet.
She lowered her head again. She tried to ignore Urbosa, tried to ignore the cold and the uncomfortable way her ceremonial robe was sticking to her legs, making it feel like they were coated in ice. She tried to ignore how hungry she was. How bored. How many hours she'd been doing this. The sun had been up when she started, and it had been night for a while, now. But she hadn't heard. So she tried to pray.
Please, please,
she whispered.
If anyone can hear me, please answer me. Any of the spirits. Any of the gods. Dinral. Ilia.
She hesitated.
And Mother.
The thoughts came back. Urbosa was waiting for her on the shore. Zelda had been in her room when Lady Urbosa, she corrected herself, though Urbosa insisted that she not use a title when they were alone, had held an audience with her father. Nobody could be rude to the king regent. That was the rule, even if it wasn't a law. Maybe Urbosa hadn't been rude, but she had raised her voice, loud enough that everyone in the castle had heard it. She'd said things that Zelda didn't understand, muffled by distance and by stone, but she'd been so angry. Zelda had spent long minutes thinking that Urbosa was angry with her failure, angry that she hadn't been allowed to come visit Gerudo Town because her power hadn't awoken yet. Her stomach had been twisted into knots while she sat on her bed, waiting for Urbosa to come in and tell her how angry she was, how she had to try harder. But it hadn't happened that way. Urbosa had come in, stepping so softly, and sat on the bed next to her and put an arm around her and held her for a long, long time, and then said they'd be traveling together for a little while. No gods escorting Zelda to the springs this time. Just the two of them. The idea had made Zelda so happy it had scared her. Being that happy was... It was wrong, wasn't it? It felt wrong. She'd been that happy for the days of travel, riding behind Urbosa on her big mare. They'd talked and laughed and ate, and for a little while the whole world had gone away. But sometimes, when she thought Zelda wasn't paying attention, Urbosa would look at her and her face would be so sad. That reminded Zelda that she could not be completely happy. Once she was finished, then she could be happy. Then she could go be with Urbosa all she liked. This was just a small part of her life, a temporary thing, and it had to be put aside. But not yet. Now, shivering under the waterfall that flowed into the spring, she felt miserable. But it was a satisfied kind of miserable. This is how it was supposed to be. Cold, and trying to pray, and hungry, all meant that she was really trying. She was being the good, strong princess that Hyrule needed. This was the right thing. So why wasn't anyone answering her?
I don't know what I'm doing wrong,
she said. Was this praying? It wasn't any of the prayers she'd been told to repeat, that those prayers didn't make sense and had been made up by people who weren't her mother.
I don't understand. I try, and nothing happens. Everyone in my family has been able to do this for so long. Mother and grandmother could both talk to the voices from the spirit realm, and their mothers and grandmothers, aunts, and everyone. through our whole history, everyone. But not me. I don't understand.
She was shivering.
Mother, I don't understand. You made everything sound so easy, like it would just happen one day. Like you would show it to me one time and I would understand. But you never did, and now I can't figure it out. What am I doing wrong? What am I?
Maybe it's not something I'm doing. She was very still. Then, this felt important. Some deeper truth. Something to help, or at least let her know what was wrong. How to address it. She pursued the thought, chasing it wherever it saw fit to lead her. If I'm praying like I'm supposed to, if I'm opening myself up to the gods and no one's answering. She was tired. So tired. The world shifted around her, just a little, and the night was filled with dark spots. Maybe it's me. Maybe there's something wrong with. There was water in her nose and mouth, and she tried to raise her head and gasp, but there was no air and she couldn't breathe. She choked thrash, tried to find her way up, couldn't. She realized, calmly, that the water around here wasn't even that deep, but now she was tangled in her robes. The dark spots were growing darker. She couldn't hear anything over the sound of her own thrashing. Hands plunged into the water and grabbed hold of her and lifted her up, clear into the air. She was still choking, and then there was a pressure on her diaphragm, hard, and she coughed so hard that she spewed water out like a fountain. She coughed again, breathed in a ragged gasp, coughed, then vomited. She was floating in the air, a heavy pressure on her stomach, and she watched the water fall from her mouth into the pool below. She breathed again, coughed, didn't have anything else to throw up, and started to cry. Urbosa was holding her, then, pressing Zelda's head against her shoulder and stroking her back.
There. SSSHHH. I've got you. It's all right. I have to.
Talking was hard, so hard she couldn't do it right. She wanted to object as Urbosa started wading back to shore. The depth of the pool didn't even come up to the chief's knees, but the words wouldn't come out.
No, that's enough for one night. No more talking, for now. Just breathe.
She wanted to object. She was supposed to be praying. If it hurt, that meant she was doing it right. Suffering meant she was doing it right. If she didn't keep doing it right, it wouldn't work. But Urbosa's arms were firm, the curve of her shoulder was comfortable, and her skin was warm to the touch. Zelda wanted to argue, but couldn't. She held firmly onto the chief, resting, trying not to fall asleep, trying not to think about how Urbosa had seen her throw up. Urbosa brought her back to dry land, talking quietly and constantly to her in Gerudo, not any particular thing but little assurances that she would be all right. Everything would be fine now. It took very little time to get camp set up. Instead of making the fire by hand, Urbosa blasted the kindling with lightning, which was exciting and much faster, and almost before she knew it, Zelda was in dry clothes and a warm blanket, Urbosa seated next to her. She leaned against Urbosa's hip and watched the fire. Both of them were quiet for a long, long time. Zelda realized, after a while, that Urbosa was waiting for her to fall asleep. And she did need it. She was so tired. But she didn't want to yet. She could feel the disappointment in the air, the wrongness. She'd done badly again, hadn't managed to awaken to the powers she was supposed to have inherited. She'd just made another mess. It felt like that's all she'd been doing for ever. And now she'd have to tell her father how she'd come all this way, spent days traveling, inconvenienced an important diplomat, and prayed, and nothing. She could see his face now, the way he'd look at her with that same stony expression. How he'd just keep not smiling, never smiling. She breathed through her mouth, because her sinuses were clogged now. She felt it when Urbosa shifted to look down at her, but she couldn't hide it now.
Zelda,
Urbosa said. No questions. No judgment. A warm hand on her shoulder.
I can't.
She hiccuped. She didn't know what words she was trying to say until they were tumbling out.
I can't tell him. I can't.
Thunder rumbled in the distance, like a promise. Urbosa's hand stroked her back. There were no questioning, no cajoling, no pressure.
He's so sad, Urbosa. He's been so sad ever since Mother died, and if I can't do this, then he'll never be happy anymore. And The people in the castle, they see it too, and they don't.
Urbosa lifted her again, holding her tightly, but did not try to quiet her.
They can all see I'm not good enough. They can all see it just like father sees it, and I'm supposed to be good enough, but I'm not, and...
She had to fight for this, but it was true, and getting the words out was as important as getting the water out of her lungs had been.
They can all see it. They can all see me. The things I can't do.
She couldn't get it out. For some reason she thought it might be easier if she didn't use the words, if she didn't keep it in her own tongue. She pushed herself back from Urbosa's chest, looking up at the chief of the Gerudo. Urbosa was sad, dear. It was not the same kind of sadness as father, or the people in the castle. It was a different kind, and that mattered. It had to matter. Zelda said in her very formal, stilted Gerudo,
"Why can I not do as the royal daughters of the past have done? What is wrong with me?"
Urbosa's mouth made a turn downward, forming deep creases on her cheeks while she squeezed her eyes shut. It was an expression Zelda had seen only once before, when she had taken Urbosa's hand at the funeral 2 years ago. She'd never forgotten that look. It hurt to see that look on Urbosa's face, to realize that she had been the cause of it, and now she had hurt Urbosa the same as she'd hurt everyone else. She clutched hard to Urbosa, as if that would fix the hurt she'd done, as if she could undo the wound to Urbosa's heart.
"I'm sorry,"
she said, slipping back into Hylian.
"I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. It's okay. Everything will be all right. Please, Urbosa, don't." SSSSHHH.
Urbosa laid her broad hand against Zelda's head, forcing it gently down until the princess was resting on her shoulder.
"No, my little bird. Do not be sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for."
"But..."
"No more."
For all the pain that had been in her face, Urbosa's tone was controlled, calm, soothing, as if nothing was wrong, and Zelda couldn't lift her head to check if that matched her expression.
"No more, Danette. I will talk to your father. I will make sure that he's not upset with you."
More thunder.
"You are loved. Believe that, if you believe nothing else. Even if the gods are unkind, even if they are deaf to your wishes, you are loved. I will help you see this through."
Zelda thought to respond, realized she was too tired. Nodded.
"Rest, little bird. You can lean on me for as long as you need."
Zelda rested, held by Urbosa, seated in the light of a warm fire. She slept. The feeling that Zelda carried up out of her memory, as she returned to herself, was not the shame of that lonely child from so long ago. She'd had cried enough of carrying shame for something that was no longer true and had never been, to the best of her recollection, her fault. There was a simmering anger on that child's behalf, a resentment for the people who had piled so many expectations on top of someone who was so small, who was supposed to ascend to godhood without a guide, without knowing how it could be done at all. There was a defiant sense that she had managed to achieve what they did not believe her capable of, however badly things had gone after. There was a sense that she had been done a terrible wrong, in that long ago, forgotten life. What clung to her most insistently was the warmth of Urbosa's chest, and the firm pressure of her hand, and the soothing tone of her voice. She let that feeling, that belonging, infuse every part of her. Zelda wiped at her eyes, then realized she was staring at Riju, and more than that, Riju was staring at her. The young chief had tilted up the thunder helm and was now peering at her with a mix of fascination and genuine alarm.
"In my estimation,"
Zelda said, putting on a grin that she knew looked too natural,
"it looks a bit big." "You don't say."
Keeping her eyes on Zelda, Riju removed the thunder helm and returned it to its pedestal.
"Forgive my rudeness. Seeing you wearing the thunder helm, I was reminded of Lady Urbosa, and a memory chose that moment to unearth itself. Please do not concern yourself."
In that moment, Zelda was forced to admire Riju, how smoothly she could take these preposterous ideas and at least put on the appearance of incorporating them into a new understanding of the world.
"If I have aided you in your recovery, then I've already done the world a great service."
She paused for a moment.
"Stories say that you usually need to rest after recovering one of your memories. Would you like to continue applying in the morning?"
Zelda had to stop herself from sighing in relief.
"That would be most appreciated." "Yes." "In that case, meet me in the audience room at any time after dawn." Do you need an escort on your way to the inn? No.
She thought further on it.
No, thank you. I do not think I am very likely to be waylaid. I will not be returning to the inn first. At any rate, I must go and collect Paya.
Ouija nodded. A knowing smile played across her lips, and for all the world she looked much wiser than her years would suggest.
I suspect you two still have much to talk about. I suspect you are right. Thank you, Chief Riju.
Zelda bowed. Ouija respectfully inclined her head, and Zelda turned and proceeded down the stairs to the audience chamber. She thought she heard Bully Era speaking to Riju in a low voice, and then Riju snapping back with something, but she couldn't be sure. It might have been a conversation drifting up from the plaza, after all. Walking through the audience room and stepping out into the training square again, Zelda was greeted by the sight of people eating. Gerudo, Rito, and Hylian women were gathered in small clumps, eating hot bowls of food and swapping stories and laughing and shouting and cajoling, with jokes being translated into 2 or 3 languages as they were told so that they were repeated, staggered waves of laughter that rippled across the gathered crowd. There was an air of vivacity to the people in that square that it was easy to get swept up by. There were even 2 Gorons in the plaza, though they were playing wallflower and not participating in the festivities directly. Zelda passed through the crowd again, letting the voices sweep over her. No one knew her here, she was sure, and there was a sense of safety and security in the knowledge that no one could recognize her face. An old hand holding a spoon waved in the air, catching her attention, and she was corrected. An elder, skin all wrinkles and eyes that seemed small in their sockets, waved her down. The same woman who had waved her down before, only now she was holding what looked like a bowl of hot stew. As if to confirm that, yes, she meant Zelda. She tapped on the bowl with her spoon and then pointed at Zelda as she moved through the crowd. This was no longer a friendly offer, it was a matronly command. Beryl, you look hungry. Come eat. The look said. Zelda went through several possibilities in her head. Discarded most of them. She smiled at the elder, then pointed at the barracks, pointed at the bowl, and held up 2 fingers. The elder pointed at the bowl, held up 2 fingers, pointed at Zelda and the barracks, and held up 2 fingers once more, tilting her head inquisitively. Zelda nodded. The elder turned down the corners of her mouth in an approving or appreciative scowl, nodded, then turned away to fill a second bowl. Zelda continued into the barracks. Lena and Kata were nowhere to be seen, and now groups she didn't recognize were telling their own story of gathering people up during the shockwaves of Ganon's attack. There had been some resistance, particularly from the very young and very old. No one paid her any mind as she stepped into the infirmary. Paya was writing in her diary. The god still stood next to her, though she looked noticeably bored. Both looked up when Zelda entered the room. The god's eyes lit up while Paya's swept down again. Zelda breathed in once, steeling herself as she walked across the room.
Chief Riju has assented to the release of the patient,
Zelda said.
In that case, I will take my leave,
the god said, and then she was gone, taking long strides that had her out the door almost before the sentence was finished. She had her own carousing to get up to, Zelda suspected. Zelda had expected that Paya would leap out of the bed, now that she was no longer being confined, but the Shaker girl did not do so. She stared down at her hands, and did not stop while Zelda pulled up a chair again.
I remembered Urbosa,
Zelda said. Paya's eyes darted up, and the look that crossed her face could only be described as a mixture of happiness and disappointment at not having been there for Zelda.
Oh. Well, I recovered a memory about her. I remember how I felt about her in those moments, all the thoughts that passed through my mind about her. Though I suppose I don't really remember her, still.
Zelda winced. She was chasing shadows.
I'm sorry, I got distracted again. Please, there is no need to apologize.
Paya, Zelda said, letting her irritation show just enough to make the other woman's eyes widen.
Regardless of what you do or don't decide, I will not stand on formalities with you. Not after everything we've been through together. I wasn't. I know you didn't mean to.
She was still irritated, but it was hard to keep that feeling when it came to Paya.
But even if what happened today splits us apart, I'm not going to let it come between us personally. I won't. All right?
Paya finally raised her head, and was blinking rapidly.
Yes. All right. I spoke to Chief Riju. Talking to her, remembering Urbosa.
She shook her head.
I wish I had taken the time to come up with a speech, Paya. An argument. A single, irrefutable point that would make you decide you wanted to stay with me.
She sighed.
I didn't. And, now that I've had time to think about it, I won't.
That hung in the air. Then Paya said,
You'll accept my decision? Yes. No matter what that decision is, I will respect it.
She reached out, laying her hand on Paya's, and this time there was no flinching or pulling away.
I need you to understand two things, though. Will you listen?
A nod, hesitant and wary.
Firstly, I want you to make this decision tomorrow. I will speak to you about it no more than this. I know that's selfish. I'm hoping, more than a little, that my proximity will convince you when my words can't. But I'm also hoping that you'll have time to think it over, be a few hours removed from the shock of fighting Ganon, and if you decide to go home, then you will do so more confidently, and you will have no regrets. Can you do that for me?
Paya smiled, and it was amused and sad and a little rueful.
That's not so much an understanding, as it is a request. Bart? Yes. Yes, I can make that decision tomorrow.
Now Zelda felt a bite of shame, but regardless of her embarrassment, she would not look away from Paya.
You are right. I'm sorry. And thank you. The second thing, though, is this: if you do leave, if you do return to Kakariko village, you will go with my blessing, figuratively and literally. I do not think that you would be in more danger now than before. In fact, I suspect you will be in much less, with the Yiga gone, but I would still put what protections on you that I can. If we do not see each other again before I face the calamity, I will still worry for you. I will still fight to protect you, as well as everyone else. I will still.
She cleared her throat.
I will still want to talk. When you're ready.
Paya very visibly fought the urge to hide her face behind her hands while she nodded.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I've had time to think today, and even if I worry, and even if that makes me vulnerable to our enemies, then I want the vulnerability to be a strength, too. I will fight on behalf of the people of Hyrule, of the champions, of Link, and of you, and for all of you I will be stronger. I've been weak, Paya. I've been afraid of being hurt, afraid of what it might mean to let the world touch my heart. No more of that.
Ah. 3 things, then. She'd gone on too long.
Excuse me. Sorry. That's all.
Another, longer silence. Zelda had had more than enough of long silences today, as if it had been one long silence broken up by moments of unbelievable noise. But this one she let stretch out longer. For Paya. For herself.
Shall we go back to the inn for now, then?
Paya's question was soft-spoken.
Not yet,
Zelda said.
I'm reasonably sure that we have 2 bowls of stew waiting for us in the training yard.
Paya got up from the bed, putting her diary away in her pouch.
2 bowls of stew? Yes, possibly 4. I probably should have asked more explicitly. Still, if it's 4, that's all right. I've worked up an appetite.
They left together. When they reached the yard, Zelda led Paya through the crowd by her hand. There were 2 bowls waiting for them, though those 2 were refilled more than once. End of chapter.